The territorial surveyor stood at the base of a sandstone cliff, looked up at the woman hauling lumber up a rope ladder, and told her she was building the most dangerous dwelling he'd seen in 15 years of frontier work. He wasn't alone. By October, every rancher within 30 miles was talking about the widow who'd lost her senses, building a house hanging off a cliff face with her young daughter. They called it everything from suicide to child endangerment. Some laughed. Others prepared for the inevitable tragedy. But when January's blizzard buried the valley under 6 feet of snow and temperatures dropped to 25 below zero, something impossible happened inside that cliff alcove. Warmth radiating from hidden chambers. Natural protection from wind that destroyed every ground structure. And secrets that would change everything the territory thought it knew about survival and the land itself. Today, you'll understand why the most mocked dwelling became the most studied structure in Utah territory, and how a shelter everyone dismissed as madness saved lives through both its position and what lay hidden within its walls. Catherine Ross stood at the base of a towering sandstone cliff in September 1888, holding her daughter's hand and looking up at the natural alcove her husband had shown her 3 years earlier, before the fever took him and left her with an 8-year-old child, a wagon, and a land deed to 20 acres of what everyone called worthless cliff country. She was 28 years old, educated at a normal school in Boston before marrying a geologist who'd brought her west, and she understood something the ranchers and settlers didn't. Her husband had chosen this land not despite the cliffs, but because of them. Thomas Ross had died in the spring of 1885, burning with fever in a boarding house room, while Catherine held his hand and Emma cried in the corner. His last coherent words were about the cliff, about passages he'd found, about warmth in the stone that defied the season. The doctor had dismissed it as delirium. Catherine had written every word in her notebook, understanding that dying men sometimes see most clearly what they'd spent their lives seeking. For 3 years after, she'd worked as a teacher in Salt Lake City, saving every dollar, studying Thomas's geological surveys at night, teaching Emma to read from her father's notebooks filled with technical drawings and measurements. The land deed sat in a trunk, paid for but unused, waiting until Catherine understood enough to continue what Thomas had started. The alcove was massive, carved by wind and water over millennia, a natural shelter 40 feet deep, 60 feet wide, and 20 feet high at its center, positioned 70 feet above the valley floor. The sandstone overhang created a protective ceiling. The back wall curved inward, offering protection from the elements. And her husband's geological surveys, the notebooks he'd left her, indicated something else. Thermal vents in the rock, ancient passages, chambers that maintained stable temperatures year-round. He'd died before he could explore them fully. Catherine had decided to build where he'd dreamed and discover what he'd only theorized. Her daughter Emma, 8 years old and already accustomed to being different, looked up at the cliff and asked the practical question. "How do we get up there?" Catherine smiled. "We build a ladder. Then we build stairs. Then we build a home." The criticism started before she'd even purchased rope. Frank Dalton, who owned the largest ranch in the valley, came to her boarding room in town and spoke with the blunt concern of a man who'd seen too many frontier deaths. "Mrs. Ross, that cliff is a death trap. One slip and you'll kill yourself and that child. You've got a teaching certificate. Work in town, live like a civilized person." Catherine thanked him for the concern and bought 200 feet of rope, lumber, tools, and pulleys with the last of her savings. Malcolm Chen, the territorial surveyor who'd filed her claim, found her at the cliff base 2 days later. She was rigging a rope ladder, testing knots, preparing to climb. He watched her check each connection with the precision of someone who understood that mistakes had consequences. "You know what you're doing with those knots," he observed. "My husband taught me," Catherine said. "He was particular about rope work, climbing safety. He spent 3 years studying this cliff." Chen looked up at the alcove. "What makes it worth dying for?" Catherine met his eyes. "I'm not planning to die. I'm planning to survive better than anyone in this valley." Chen was quiet for a moment. He was 42, half Chinese, raised in California mining camps where his father had worked as an engineer, and he'd learned that the people most likely to succeed on the frontier were the ones everyone called crazy until proven right. "You'll need help," he said. "I can't pay," Catherine replied. "I'm not asking for pay," Chen said. "I'm asking if you need help." Over the next 8 weeks, Malcolm Chen became a regular presence at the cliff. He helped Catherine rig a pulley system to haul materials up the rope ladder, engineering a counterweight mechanism that allowed her to lift 100-pound loads alone when he wasn't there. He climbed with her to the alcove, inspected its structure, and admitted that the geology was sound. The sandstone overhang had stood for thousands of years and would stand for thousands more. The rock face showed no signs of instability, no cracks suggesting imminent collapse, no water erosion that would weaken the alcove's ceiling. He helped build the first permanent wooden stairs, zigzagging up the cliff face in 3 sections with landings, anchored to the rock with iron bolts drilled deep into solid stone. Each bolt hole required an hour of careful drilling with hand tools, angling into the sandstone at precise depths to ensure maximum holding strength. They tested each anchor with weighted loads before trusting human weight to them. The work took 3 weeks of Sundays, dangerous and precise. Catherine learned to drill while hanging from ropes, to trust her knots, to calculate load-bearing requirements for stairs that would carry supplies, furniture, everything needed for life 70 feet above the ground. Emma helped where she could, learning knots from Chen's patient instruction, organizing tools in order of use, understanding through observation that survival sometimes required building what others called impossible. She was too young for most of the dangerous work, but old enough to understand that her mother was building their future, one carefully drilled bolt at a time. The town's opinion calcified quickly. At the general store, women whispered loudly enough for Catherine to hear. "Building on a cliff with a child. Unnatural. If her husband could see this madness, he'd be ashamed." At the land office, men made bets on how long before the wind blew her structure off the rock, or before she fell and orphaned her daughter. The only defender was Chen, who quietly told anyone who asked that Mrs. Ross understood geology better than most men with surveying degrees, and that her husband had been one of the finest geologists he'd known. This earned him mockery too. "The Chinaman's defending her because he's courting her," someone said at the saloon. Chen ignored it and continued helping every Sunday, his only day free from surveying work. By late October, the basic structure was complete. Catherine had built a wooden platform extending from the alcove floor, creating usable space. She'd constructed adobe walls using clay from the valley floor mixed with sand and straw, filling in the alcove's open front except for a door and 3 windows. She'd installed a roof using salvaged timber and tar paper, though the natural rock overhang did most of the weatherproofing. The dwelling had 2 rooms in front, a living area and a sleeping space. But the real secret was in the back. Catherine had found what her husband's notebooks predicted: natural passages extending into the cliff, chambers carved by ancient water, and vents that released warm air year-round. She explored carefully with rope, lanterns, and her daughter waiting at safe distances, marking each passage on hand-drawn maps that matched Thomas's sketches with eerie accuracy. He'd been right. Everything he'd theorized existed exactly where he'd predicted it would be. The main passage led to a large chamber 30 feet into the cliff, where the air was noticeably warmer than outside, where the rock walls radiated gentle heat, and where her husband's notes indicated geothermal activity far below heated the stone. The chamber was roughly circular, 20 feet across, with a ceiling that curved naturally like a dome. The walls were smooth, polished by ancient water that no longer flowed here. The temperature, measured carefully with a thermometer, held steady at 67 degrees, regardless of outside conditions. She tested this over 2 weeks in late October, recording measurements morning and night, watching outside temperatures drop from 60 degrees to 35 degrees, while the chamber never varied more than 2 degrees. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just shelter. It was a natural heating system that required no fuel, no maintenance, no human effort beyond accessing it. Thomas had known. He'd died before he could prove it, but he'd known. She built a door to this chamber and kept it locked. The town didn't need to know about it yet. Emma was the first to understand what the chamber meant. She stood in its warmth in early November, when outside temperatures had dropped to freezing, and asked, "Is this why Papa wanted to build here?" "Yes," Catherine said. "This is why." By December, Catherine and Emma had moved in completely. The front rooms were cozy, heated by a small iron stove that required far less wood than traditional cabins, because the back chambers radiated warmth through the shared walls. The windows captured southern sun. The alcove protected them from wind. The elevated position meant no snow accumulation at their door, no flooding, no ground moisture. Malcolm Chen visited on a Sunday in mid-December, climbing the stairs with a smoked ham as a gift. Catherine made coffee, and they sat at her small table while Emma drew pictures by the window. "How warm does that back chamber stay?" Chen asked quietly. Catherine had been expecting this question. He was an engineer. He understood thermodynamics. "About 65 degrees, she said, year-round." Chen looked at the door to the passage. Geothermal. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. "That's why he bought this land. That's why." Chen smiled slightly. "Everyone thinks you're crazy. You're actually the most practical person in the territory." Catherine felt something shift in that moment, something that had been building over weeks of shared work and mutual respect. "Malcolm, why do you help me?" Chen looked at her directly. "Because my father died in a mine collapse when I was 12. And my mother raised me alone in a mining camp where everyone said a Chinese widow couldn't survive. She survived by being smarter than everyone who doubted her. You remind me of her. And because I stopped feeling alone when I started climbing this cliff." Catherine understood what he was carefully not saying directly. The frontier had rules about widows and courtship, about propriety and waiting periods. But it also had a simpler rule. People who survived together sometimes built something more than friendship. "I'm glad you come here," she said. Emma looked up from her drawing and asked with 8-year-old directness, "Mr. Chen, are you going to be my new papa?" Malcolm looked stunned. Catherine felt her face flush. "Emma, that's not... It's complicated," Catherine said. "Why?" Emma asked. "He helps us. He's kind. You smile more when he's here. Papa would like him." Out of the mouths of children came truth that adults spent months dancing around. Malcolm recovered first. "Emma, that would be something your mother and I would need to discuss carefully," he said. "But I'd be honored to be your friend. Is that enough for now?" Emma considered this seriously. "For now," she agreed. The first serious test came in early January 1889. A massive blizzard rolled down from the north, visible for hours as a dark wall advancing across the desert, dropping temperatures to 25 below zero and burying the valley under 6 feet of snow in 3 days. Wind gusts reached 60 miles per hour, strong enough to pick up a grown man, strong enough to tear roofs from buildings not properly secured. The sound was apocalyptic, a constant roar that made conversation impossible even indoors. Every structure in the valley fought for survival. The Dalton Ranch lost 2 outbuildings when wind tore the roofs off, despite being weighted with stones and anchored with iron cables. 3 families in the settlement had to abandon their cabins when chimneys collapsed from ice buildup, or when fires became too dangerous to maintain in the violent wind that created backdrafts down flues. The Morrison family barely escaped when a chimney fire spread to their roof timbers. Everyone who could move sheltered together in the church and the general store, burning furniture when wood supplies ran low, huddling in the center of rooms away from walls that leaked cold through every gap, praying the storm would break before someone froze, or before the buildings themselves failed. Children cried from the cold, despite being wrapped in every blanket families owned. Adults took shifts, staying awake to keep fires burning, to watch for structural failures, to ensure no one in their groups succumbed to the insidious sleep that came with severe cold. It was the kind of storm that killed people, that tested every decision made in preparation, that separated the lucky from the dead. Catherine and Emma sat in their cliff dwelling, completely protected, experiencing the storm as distant drama rather than immediate threat. The alcove blocked the wind entirely, the massive sandstone overhang deflecting gusts that would have torn their structure apart if exposed. They could hear the wind, a constant roar echoing through the valley below, but felt only occasional gentle breezes that found their way into the protected space. Snow fell in thick curtains beyond their platform, visible through the windows, accumulating in deep drifts on the valley floor, but none reached their elevated position. The wind patterns kept their platform swept clear. The back chamber's warmth radiated through the walls, supplemented by a small fire in the iron stove that Catherine fed twice daily with carefully rationed wood. She'd prepared well, stacking cords of wood in the protected alcove where it stayed dry, but she barely needed it. Interior temperature held at 62 degrees with minimal burning. They had food, dried goods purchased in bulk, smoked meat hanging in the coolest part of the front room, and water from melted snow collected in barrels positioned to catch runoff from the alcove ceiling. They had books borrowed from a Salt Lake City library, a luxury Catherine had insisted on despite the cost. Emma played with a wooden doll Malcolm had carved for her, a detailed piece showing hours of careful work, moving it through elaborate scenarios on the floor while her mother read aloud from adventure novels. Catherine read her husband's notebooks, studying the passages he'd mapped, the thermal measurements he'd recorded, the geological wonders he'd begun to understand. At night, they slept warm under wool blankets in their elevated home, while the valley below fought for survival 70 feet beneath them. The contrast was absolute and vindication of every choice Catherine had made. On the 3rd night, Catherine opened the door to the back chamber and took Emma inside to show her something. Deep in the passage, in a side chamber she had explored carefully, water seeped from the rock at a steady temperature of 58 degrees. Not hot, but warm enough to never freeze. A reliable water source year-round, independent of snow or rain or drought. "This is what makes this place special," Catherine told her daughter. "The cliff isn't just shelter. It's alive with heat from deep in the earth. It provides what we need." Emma touched the warm stone walls with wonder. "Did Papa know about this?" "He suspected," Catherine said. "He didn't have time to prove it. We're proving it now." The storm broke on January 12th. As people emerged from emergency shelters and assessed damage, word spread about an impossible observation: smoke rising from the cliff dwelling. The widow and child had stayed in the cliff through the worst blizzard in 20 years. Frank Dalton rode out to the cliff base as soon as the snow allowed travel. He called up to Catherine, who appeared on her platform wrapped in a shawl, looking comfortable and rested. "You survived," Dalton called up, clearly surprised. "We're quite well," Catherine replied. "How is the valley?" Dalton explained the damage, the cold, the families who'd nearly frozen despite burning everything they could find for heat. His voice carried confusion and something like respect. "How did you stay warm?" "The cliff provides," Catherine said simply. Dalton rode back to town and told people what he'd seen. The impossible had happened. The cliff dwelling hadn't just survived, it had thrived. By February, curiosity overcame skepticism. Malcolm Chen brought the territorial governor's representative, who was touring to assess storm damage. Catherine showed them the front rooms, explained the passive solar through the windows, the wind protection from the alcove, the minimal heating requirements. And then, because they'd proven themselves trustworthy, she showed them the back chamber. The representative stood in the warm passage, felt the heated stone, understood immediately what it meant. "This is a natural resource," he said quietly. "Geothermal heat, stable temperature year-round." "Mrs. Ross, do you understand the implications?" "My husband did," Catherine said. "That's why he bought this land." "How deep do the passages go?" "We don't know yet," Catherine admitted. "I've explored perhaps 200 feet safely. The passages extend further. There are chambers I haven't reached." The representative looked at Chen. "This needs to be surveyed properly, mapped, documented." Chen nodded. "I've been suggesting that. Catherine has the best claim to this resource, but it should be understood scientifically." Within a week, the territorial government offered Catherine a contract. She would allow Chen to conduct official surveys of the passages in exchange for clear title to all geothermal resources discovered on her land. She agreed. The surveys began in March and continued through spring. Chen and Catherine explored together, with Emma waiting in safe chambers when the passages got technical. They discovered a network of interconnected caves, some with warm air rising from vents, others with water seeping from walls, all maintaining temperatures between 55 and 70 degrees year-round. In one deep chamber, they found evidence of ancient Native American use, charcoal from fires centuries old, proof that others had known this place was special. The relationship between Chen and Catherine evolved through these explorations, built on shared discovery and mutual respect. He taught her surveying techniques. She taught him her husband's geological theories. They worked as partners, and somewhere in the darkness of ancient passages, Catherine realized she'd fallen in love with this patient, brilliant man who'd helped her build something impossible and never asked for credit. On a warm April evening, sitting on the platform watching sunset paint the valley in shades of orange and red that matched the sandstone cliffs, watching shadows lengthen and the first stars emerge in a sky so clear it seemed infinite, Malcolm asked her carefully, with the hesitation of a man who understood the risk he was taking. When enough time has passed that people won't judge harshly, would you consider marrying again? Catherine smiled, understanding what he was asking, but wanting clarity between them. No assumptions, no implications left unspoken. By whose judgment? The people who said this cliff would kill us? The people who predicted we'd fall or freeze or fail? Their judgment doesn't concern me anymore, Malcolm. His meaning had been clear, but she wanted him to say it directly, to speak plainly what they'd both been carefully not acknowledging for months. Malcolm took her hand, his engineer's hands calloused from rope work and drilling, warm and steady. Catherine, I'm not asking hypothetically. I'm asking if you'd marry me. Not today, not tomorrow, but when you're ready. When enough time has passed that Emma won't feel we're replacing her father, because we're not. I want to be her father too, if she'll have me. I want to build a life with you in this impossible place, and see what else we can discover together. I want to explore the deep passages and document what your husband theorized, and teach Emma everything I know about surveying and engineering. I want to wake up in this cliff dwelling and work beside you and grow old watching sunsets from this platform. If you'll have me. Catherine said yes without hesitation. The frontier didn't allow for long courtships when survival depended on partnership. Emma, listening through the window as children often did when adults thought them occupied, cheered loud enough to echo off the sandstone walls. They married in June 1889, quietly in town with Emma as witness. The town's reaction was mixed, some approving, others scandalized that a widow had remarried so quickly and to a Chinese surveyor. Catherine and Malcolm ignored both approval and scandal with equal disinterest. They were too busy working. By autumn, the cliff dwelling had become a destination for curious minds rather than skeptical mockery. Territorial geologists came to study the passages, measuring temperatures at different depths, analyzing the rock composition, trying to understand the heat source that kept the chambers warm. A professor from the University of Utah spent 3 days mapping the ventilation system, discovering that warm air rose through natural chimneys in the rock, while cool air was drawn in through lower passages, creating a self-regulating circulation that required no human intervention. A mining company offered to buy the land for geothermal exploitation, proposing to drill deep wells and extract heat commercially. Catherine refused. This wasn't a resource to be extracted and exhausted, she explained. It was a natural system to be understood and used sustainably. Instead, she and Malcolm developed it carefully, with Emma's help as she grew old enough to understand the principles they were applying. They built a second dwelling in the alcove, connected to the first by a covered walkway, specifically for guests and researchers who wanted to study the geothermal system. The second dwelling was intentionally simpler, designed to demonstrate how little was actually needed when natural advantages were properly utilized. They installed a system to pipe warm air from the back chambers through the living spaces, using sheet metal ducts and natural convection, creating the most efficient heating system in the territory without using a single piece of mechanical equipment. Malcolm engineered it with elegant simplicity. Warm air rises, cold air sinks, and properly positioned vents harness this natural movement. They began growing vegetables in a small greenhouse built at the alcove entrance, using warm air from the vents piped underneath growing beds to extend the growing season into winter. By December, they were harvesting lettuce and radishes while snow covered the valley below. Emma, now 11 years old and helping with every project, suggested they try tomatoes. They did, and succeeded, producing ripe fruit in February that should have been impossible at their latitude and elevation. The skeptics never apologized. Frank Dalton simply stopped making jokes and started asking questions. The territorial governor visited and left impressed. The cliff dwelling appeared in geological surveys as an example of practical geothermal application using natural formations. Emma grew up climbing passages with a rope around her waist and a lantern in her hand, learning geology from her stepfather, who taught her to read rock layers like pages in a book. Understanding engineering from her mother, who showed her that mathematics and physics weren't abstract concepts, but tools for building impossible things. She became the kind of person who looked at challenges and asked how rather than why not, who saw cliffs not as barriers but as opportunities, who understood that the best solutions often came from working with nature's systems rather than fighting them. At 16, she surveyed a passage her parents had marked as too dangerous, finding it stable and discovering 2 new chambers beyond. At 20, she wrote a paper on geothermal residential design that was published in a territorial engineering journal. She never forgot that her childhood home had been built by a widow everyone mocked, heated by chambers everyone said were worthless, and proven successful by mathematics that didn't care about social convention or gender expectations. In 1903, a university professor wrote a paper on vernacular geothermal architecture in Utah Territory. He documented the Ross Chen cliff dwelling and 15 other structures built on similar principles over the following years, all influenced by Catherine's original design. His conclusion was direct. Ross demonstrated that survival in harsh climates requires understanding and utilizing natural resources rather than fighting them. The cliff's position provided wind protection, solar gain, and access to geothermal heat. These advantages, combined with sound engineering, created a structure that outperformed conventional buildings at a fraction of the fuel cost. Adoption of similar techniques across the territory reduced winter fuel consumption by an estimated 40% in areas with appropriate geological features. In other words, people believed the numbers when they couldn't deny them anymore. Catherine Ross Chen passed away in 1941 at the age of 81. Her obituary in the territorial newspaper mentioned her teaching background, her family, and her work in geothermal development. But locals remembered something different. They remembered the year a widow everyone mocked built a home on a cliff that saved her life and changed how people thought about survival in harsh lands. They remembered that she'd trusted science over convention, exploration over fear, and proven that the most mocked idea can become the wisest choice when you understand what lies beneath the surface. She wasn't being reckless. She was being practical. And sometimes, practical means building when no one else dares, discovering what no one else seeks, and proving that the secrets worth finding are the ones everyone else is too afraid to look for. The cliff dwelling stood for another 60 years, eventually incorporated into a national monument celebrating both Native American cliff dwellings and later pioneer innovations. Tour guides tell visitors about the widow who built on the cliff in 1888, but few know the full story. The hidden chambers, the geothermal vents, the passages extending into darkness, and the quiet romance that grew between a widow who trusted geology and a surveyor who trusted her vision. Emma Ross Chen donated her parents' notebooks to the Smithsonian in 1952, along with detailed maps of the passages they'd explored together. The collection includes Catherine's journals, which end with an entry from 1940. We built on the cliff because my husband saw what others missed. The earth gives warmth to those who learn its secrets. We survived by trusting science and each other. We thrived by teaching others to look beneath the surface, to question assumptions, and to understand that the best shelter isn't always the one that looks safest. It's the one that works with the land rather than against it. The greatest discovery wasn't the warm chambers or the water. It was learning that impossible and impractical are different things, and the wisdom to know which is which.